Have you ever wondered how a foreign widow with no land, no husband, and no position in Israel became part of the lineage of the greatest king in biblical history? The story of Ruth begins in one of the darkest periods of Israel. It was a time when the Bible says that everyone did what seemed right in their own eyes. A time of instability, famine, spiritual crisis, and difficult decisions. Yet it was precisely in this setting that one of the most surprising stories of the Scriptures began. The journey of a woman who left her land, abandoned her security, and chose to follow a God who was not yet her own. A quiet decision, but one that would change the destiny of a family, of a nation, and centuries later, the course of human history itself. How did a woman from Moab become part of the lineage of King David? And how did her story become connected to the arrival of the Messiah? To understand this, we must go back to the beginning, to the moment when a crisis in Bethlehem set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. There was a time in the history of Israel when the people lived without a king, without a central leadership to unite them spiritually or politically. It was the period known in the Scriptures as the time of the Judges, an era marked by repeated cycles of disobedience, crisis, and deliverance. During that time, one phrase described the spiritual condition of the nation. Everyone did what seemed right in their own eyes. This phrase was not only about personal decisions. It revealed an entire atmosphere of instability. The faith of the people fluctuated. Their faithfulness to the covenant with God was often forgotten. And as a result, the land that had been promised as a place of provision and rest frequently experienced difficult times. It was in this setting that a silent crisis began to spread through the hills of Judah. Famine. For those who live in modern cities, where food arrives daily in markets, it may be difficult to imagine the impact of famine in the ancient world. In those days, survival depended almost entirely on the harvest. If the rains failed or the crops were destroyed, entire families became vulnerable. No harvest meant no food. No food meant no security. And that is exactly what happened in Bethlehem. Bethlehem was a small town located in the hills of Judah. Its name literally meant house of bread, an ironic name, because at that moment there was no bread there. In the city called the house of bread, bread had disappeared. Among the families living, there was the family of a woman named Naomi. Naomi was an Israelite, part of the people who had received God's promise to live in that land. She was married to a man named Elimelech. Together, they had built a family and raised 2 sons, Mahlon and Kilian. Like many families of that time, they depended on the land, on the seasons, and on the rain. But when the famine arrived, reality became unavoidable. Remaining in Bethlehem meant facing growing scarcity. Perhaps days without enough food, perhaps months of uncertainty. So Elimelech made a difficult decision. one that would completely change the destiny of his family. He decided to leave the land of Judah. It was not a short trip, nor merely a change of tone. It was a migration to a foreign land. The family would cross the Jordan River and travel toward Moab. For an Israelite, Moab was not just another place. It was a land marked by deep cultural differences. The Moabites had their own traditions, their own history, and their own religious practices. It was outside the promised land. Yet when famine strikes, decisions are often made based on immediate survival. So Elimelech, Naomi, and their 2 sons left Bethlehem. Perhaps they carried only the essentials, a few provisions, some belongings, and the hope of finding a better life somewhere else. Imagine that journey, the hills of Judah fading behind them, the land where their ancestors had lived, the fields that had once been fertile, and ahead of them, a completely uncertain future. They were leaving the land God had given to Israel. But sometimes, when survival feels threatened, difficult choices are made before their consequences are fully understood. The Bible describes their move simply. They went to live in Moab. At first. The change may have brought some relief. Certain regions of Moab had fertile land, and many foreign families found work or temporary refuge there. Years began to pass. The family settled there. Sons grew older. The new land slowly stopped feeling entirely foreign. But without realizing it, this decision to cross borders was preparing the stage for one of the most remarkable stories in Israel's history. Because in that foreign land lived a young Moabite woman, a woman whose name, at that moment, had not yet appeared in the story of Israel. A woman who was not born among the covenant people. A woman who was not part of the promises given to the patriarchs. Yet soon she would make a decision capable of changing not only the destiny of one family, but the destiny of generations. And everything would begin with events that no one in that family could have predicted. Because sometimes the beginning of a great story does not look extraordinary. Sometimes it begins with something simple. A crisis, a migration, a decision made in the middle of necessity. But behind those seemingly ordinary events, something greater was quietly unfolding. A story of faith, a story of loyalty, a story that would soon place at the center of its events a woman named Ruth. And for that story to truly begin, this family would first experience losses that would change everything. But that is what we will see in the next part of the narrative. Time passed in Moab, but happiness was not permanent. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, became ill despite being away from home. He did not escape the trials of life. Elimelech died. Naomi was left alone, in a foreign land without her husband. Her 2 sons, Mahlon and Kilion, grew up and married Moabite women. One married Orpah, and the other married Ruth. Perhaps Naomi thought that the marriage of her sons would bring comfort, companionship, and the sense of a family preserved even far from home. But life, as often happens, was not kind to them. Tragedy struck again. Both sons died. Naomi found herself in an unimaginable situation. A widow. Without children. In a foreign country. No support. No inheritance. No protection. In that culture, women depended heavily on men, without a husband or sons. Survival became extremely difficult. Naomi felt sorrow, grief, and emptiness. Her heart longed for the familiar hills of Bethlehem. The land she had left in search of food now called her back, as if inviting her to return to the place she had once abandoned. She heard the news that the famine in Judah was over. It was time to return. But how could she do it alone? How could she face the journey back, knowing the people she once knew might judge her? Yet she had 2 daughters-in-law. Naomi could have asked them to return with her. She might have wished them to remain in Moab, safe and with family. She tried to convince them. Orpah, after a moment of hesitation, chose to return to her own family. But Ruth, the Moabite, surprised everyone. Ruth made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She told Naomi, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you." And, a simple sentence, yet one that carried incredible weight. Ruth chose loyalty over convenience. She chose faith over familiarity. She chose a path that no one would have expected from a young Moabite woman. This was not just a decision to follow a woman. It was a decision to follow a God she had never known deeply. Ruth was now part of Naomi's journey back to Bethlehem. The journey itself may have been long and difficult, but the spiritual and emotional journey was even greater. Crossing borders is never only a physical act. Every step toward Bethlehem was a step away from the security of the past, from everything she had known, and toward a future completely unknown. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the city had changed, and so had Naomi. She was no longer the same young woman who had left years earlier. She was older, grieved, and burdened with loss. The townspeople, seeing her return, whispered about her. "Is this Naomi?" they asked. But Naomi, aware of the depth of her sorrow, told them not to call her Naomi. She said, "Call me Mara," which means bitter, because the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. Her heart was heavy, but Ruth did not waver. Ruth worked tirelessly. She went to the fields, gleaning behind the harvesters. In ancient Israel, gleaning was allowed by law for widows, orphans, and the poor. It was a provision from God. Ruth obeyed these customs diligently. She labored not only to provide food for herself, but to care for Naomi. And in doing so, she displayed humility, diligence, and a heart ready to trust in God. Even as she faced uncertainty and rejection. It was during these moments in the fields that Ruth's story intertwined with the life of a man named Boaz. Boaz was a relative of Naomi's late husband, a man of standing, respected for his integrity and his faithfulness to God. From the first moment he noticed Ruth, he was impressed by her loyalty, her character, and her care for Naomi. He ensured that she was safe in the fields, that she had food, and that she could work without fear. Their interaction was not hurried or forced. It was a story of respect, of recognition, and of divine timing. In every step, Ruth demonstrated faithfulness. Boaz, guided by God's principles, observed and acted according to righteousness and compassion. This was not only a story about survival, it was a story about divine providence, showing that God can direct lives even in foreign lands, even in moments of grief and loss. And it reminds us that choices matter. A decision to remain loyal, to follow faith, to act with integrity, can change not only one life but generations. Ruth's decision to stay with Naomi set in motion events that would lead to her marriage to Boaz. Through that marriage, she would become part of the lineage of King David, and eventually, centuries later, she would appear in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Her simple act of loyalty, faith, and courage became part of God's larger plan. And all this began in a moment of crisis, in a famine, in a decision to leave home, and then in a decision to stay. The story of Ruth teaches us that faithfulness in the small and difficult moments can open doors to unimaginable blessings. And yet, there is still more to see, because the final part of this story will reveal the culmination of Ruth's loyalty and God's reward. A story that carries lessons for everyone who seeks to trust God in every step of life. Boaz, knowing Ruth's situation and her relationship with Naomi, acted according to the law and the tradition of Israel. He was a righteous man. Guided by the fear of God. He became Ruth's kinsman redeemer, someone who could protect, provide for, and honor the family covenant. Ruth followed every instruction with humility and courage. When she approached Boaz at night, following the customs of the time, she fully trusted God's plan. Boaz recognized her faith and loyalty. He promised to take care of her and act as redeemer, ensuring her life and Naomi's were restored. At the appointed time, Boaz formalized the union. He married Ruth. And thus the cycle of pain and loss was transformed into joy and restoration. Naomi, who had called herself Mara, bitter and full of grief, saw her life filled with hope again. What seemed impossible became possible through God's providence and human faithfulness. Ruth, a foreigner in a distant land, became the mother of Obed, who would be the grandfather of King David. And through Obed, God paved the way for the birth of Jesus Christ, the Savior. It all began with seemingly simple choices: a decision to leave, a decision to stay, a decision to act with faith and integrity. What appeared to be only a story of survival became a narrative of redemption, legacy, and hope. The book of Ruth reminds us that God acts even in moments of pain and loneliness. Asterisk, he observes every act of faithfulness, every act of love, and every heart that trusts in asterisk losses can be deep. But when we remain faithful and obedient, restoration is possible. Asterisk Ruth's life shows that courage, loyalty, and faith can transform a person's destiny. Asterisk, but it also shows us that our decisions impact future generations. A simple act of kindness or loyalty can have consequences no one can foresee. Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem with nothing, but with God. Asterisk, they trusted the path that seemed uncertain, and God guided them to provision and blessing. Asterisk, this story invites us to reflect on our own choices. Asterisk, how do we react to pain and loss? Asterisk, how do we show loyalty and faith even when no one is watching? Asterisk, how do we follow God when everything around us seems to fall apart? Asterisk Ruth's answer was simple but powerful. She chose to follow, to stay, and to trust. Asterisk, and that choice changed everything. Asterisk, it reminds us that God sees beyond immediate circumstances. Asterisk, he works through ordinary people who make extraordinary choices of faith. Asterisk, even in times of difficulty, even in foreign lands, God is faithful. He fulfills his promises in ways we often cannot immediately understand. The book of Ruth ends with hope. Asterisk, it shows us that faithfulness is rewarded, loyal love is valued, and God can turn pain into joy. Asterisk, it reminds us that, like Ruth, we can all be instruments of a greater plan, extending beyond our understanding and touching lives we have yet to meet. Asterisk, Ruth's story teaches us that life is made of decisions. Asterisk, every choice, every gesture, every act of faith has the potential to transform the present and shape the future. Asterisk, above all, it reminds us that even when everything seems lost, God is always at work. Even when we feel alone, he never abandons us. He guides, protects, and provides, often in unexpected ways, but always perfectly. Asterisk Ruth, a young woman from a foreign land, became an eternal example of faith, courage, and loyalty. Asterisk Naomi, once bitter from loss, experienced restoration and joy as she saw God's faithfulness manifest in her life. Asterisk, and all of us, hearing this story, are invited to trust, remain faithful, and believe that God can use even the hardest moments to fulfill his purposes. Asterisk, because in the end, every act of faith, every choice of loyalty, every decision to trust echoes through time and impacts the world in ways we could never imagine.